Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, after the glitz and glam of the G7 summit, world leaders returned to political earthquakes at home.
It was a G7 in a beautiful sunny place, but overshadowed by two big clouds. One was the European election, and one was the coming US election.
But what did they achieve while there? And what more awaits them? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
My name is Virginia Pietromarchi. I'm a reporter for Al Jazeera English, and I'm currently in southern Italy, Puglia, where I'm covering the G7.
So, Virginia, welcome to The Take. It's good to have you here. We're speaking to you as the G7 is wrapping up. Give me a vibe check. What has the energy been like at the summit?
Well, it has been quite of a mixed energy because we have people coming in with a very different week on their back. Like on one side, we have Giorgia Meloni, who is the sort of queen bee, the star of the show, not only because she's the host, but also because she's just came as probably the most powerful European leader in the European Union because of the election that happened a week ago.
The host of the G7, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, she emerged as a big winner in the Euro Parliament elections.
So she was obviously triumphant, and she was dressing this on the first day, like very elegant pinky suit, floating around.
Flowy pants, perfectly coiffed hair, right?
Yes, exactly. And also, I mean, they're all gathering and discussing in Borgo Ignazia, which is this sort of faux medieval style village surrounded by hills with olive trees. I mean, typical Puglia style.
Wow.
And who was she welcoming? She was welcoming...
Allora, buongiorno a tutti. Benvenuti.
Of course, the leaders of the G7, 7 countries, which also includes German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and also Emmanuel Macron of France. And they're all coming from the same week, same election, but in much worse shape because they got a really, really bad hit.
The European Parliament is the EU's only governing body directly chosen by voters. This past weekend, those voters pulled that body more to the right than it has ever been. Provisional results show Europe's centrist groups maintained their majority, but far-right parties made substantial gains, thanks in large part to Italy, Germany, and France.
On top of this, we have Joe Biden. He's, we're all waiting to understand what's going to happen in November. It's still a tight race. So there were let's say that it was a G7 in a beautiful sunny place, but overshadowed by two big clouds. One was the European election, and one was the coming US election.
Wow, a past election and an upcoming election. Okay, great imagery there. I can really picture what this was like. So let's talk about the queen bee, as you put it. Presiding over this year's G Summit was Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. She also leads the Brothers of Italy party. And as you mentioned, we are coming off the back of a major European parliamentary election. Earlier this month, that party won nearly 30% of the votes, landing them 24 seats in parliament. Tell me about her, who she is, and how is Italy faring under her?
Giorgia Meloni is known for having this very strong character, having this local Roman accent, which, people say she's part of the people. She's closer. She's not a politician that belongs to the elite. This is something that she has always gained support for. And she has made with her party an incredible rise to power. Consider that in 2018, she had 4% of the vote. And then that translated into 25%, something like that, in 2022, where she had a smashing victory at the election where she won.
It's a historic moment, not just for Giorgia Meloni, but for Italy as a country. For the first time, voters have chosen a female prime minister, one which aims to form Italy's most right-wing government since the Second World War.
And I mean, her motto is, I don't know if you remember, there was this slogan that she used a lot, and then it became a hit.
Io sono Georgia!
Which was, I am Georgia, I'm Italian, I'm a mother, I'm a Christian.
Sono cristiana!
Which obviously embodies her sort of vision, one which is based on a traditional concept of the family, a Catholic country, and one that is populated only by Italian patriots. And this motto turns out to be a little bit of a hit for herself too, because it reverberates in disco clubs in Italy because they made a sort of disco hit.
You're kidding.
Georgia! Sono una donna! Sono una madre! Sono cristiana!
So yes, that's obviously reflects very much on where she comes from. And I think that on the other side, internationally speaking, she, of course, was known to have very strong position in terms of being skeptical. But, I mean, once she gained power, she made sure she was diluting her tone. So she's now regarded as someone who is super, in alliance with the US, very pro-Ukraine. She has kind of given assurance that, she was not sliding on the other side. Still, she remains a conservative, and we're seeing her country move toward that direction.
So when Meloni won, it meant that Italy's most far-right party took office since 1946. So that was a major political shift. But here she is at the G7, as you're saying, rubbing shoulders with leaders of the center and the left and holding her own among them. So I'm wondering how her party's elections reverberated at the summit, because she entered the summit off a win.
Yes, and she's very much seizing on that. She has already managed to create a good reputation among, Biden used to be very skeptical, but now she managed to turn him around. Macron and Scholz might not be friendly, but definitely she gained her respect. So she's kind of now saying, hey guys, you cannot really tell me anything because I'm doing much better than what you guys are doing.
After the break, the other ways this G7 is breaking the mold. So, Virginia, while Meloni is riding a high from this summit, there are some who are not so lucky at home. Let's talk specifically about French President Emmanuel Macron and what's going on in French politics right now. In your words, you called the European elections a, quote, political earthquake. Can you walk me through the aftermath of the election in France and why the vote for the European Parliament, the legislative body of the EU, would cause such a ripple effect in France that Macron is still feeling it at the G7?
Well, it's funny. I said political earthquake because we expected the far right to be on a high in this election. What we didn't expect is that they were so high that one of the leaders of one of the EU countries would call for snap election.
The first casualty of the EU elections, a weakened French president. Emmanuel Macron's party was trounced by candidates for Marine Le Pen's Nationalist Party.
And this is what happened, right? So we have the party of Marine Le Pen, National Rally, who got 30% of the vote, whether Macron had 15% of the vote. So it's a huge difference. And so he said, okay, guys, let's go to the vote. Not to replace him, this is not a presidential vote, but to vote for the National Assembly, the French Parliament. So what does this mean? This is a huge political gamble because observers say that he's doing this in order to put people in front of a tough choice, like either me or the far right. He's using the card to play the fear of the far right. But he fails the gamble, then that's a stepping stone for Marine Le Pen to become president in 2025. So it's a big risk.
So what is Macron facing when he goes home?
Well, he's facing an election in just a few weeks. We will have a first round on June 30 and then a second one on July the 7th. So he has really a few weeks' time to convince French people that he's the best pick for the country.
So that is one of the things that leaders at the G7 were contending with, the results of these elections. But I want to talk about some of the other major issues that took center stage at the summit. And one of them is immigration. There's one bit of foreign policy that Maloney pushed, and that is the Mate Plan. It's meant to boost development in Africa, but it's also meant to limit immigration to Europe from Africa. Talk to me about the genesis of this plan. It couldn't have just come up now. This is something that she has been pushing for a while now. What is it?
The plan, it's a bit of a big question mark for many. Like, she announced this at the UN General Assembly last year, and then she had an Italy-Africa summit in January, and nobody really knew about details of this plan. She's basically trying to put in place a process that fits her vision to start doing businesses in Africa. Obviously, for one reason, to respond to key strategic interests of the country, because Italy sits right in between the global north and the so-called global south, and she want to become this key hub in between that can bridge the two worlds. Two main reasons, obviously. One is because she's very well aware that 30% of natural resources, of minerals, are actually in the continent. And on the other reason, because the continent holds 8% of global gas revenues. So she said, well, we gotta get something. I mean, we need to somehow launch some programs. And how do we do when Europe still has such a strong colonial baggage? And so she want to play the card of like, look at us. We have a slightly lighter colonial baggage compared to other countries. Though this has drawn some criticism because, first of all, for example, when there was the Italy-Africa summit, no African partner had been consulted. Like, nobody really knew about this. And even the chair of the African Union back then said, well, we're not beggars. So, like, maybe a little bit more of communication would have helped. And on the other side, you have a second stronger criticism, which is, yes, Italy want to somehow give money with the idea to boost the economy in those countries. But first of all, she doesn't have the resources to do so.
The European Union and Tunisia are aiming to stem the movement of irregular migration and shut down the traffickers. Under the agreement, the EU will help strengthen Tunisia's borders.
And on the other side, it's seen as a sort of way to, cover harsher restriction on migration from especially Tunisia and Northern African countries, because we have seen very important deals with Tunisia and Albania to somehow basically giving financial support in exchange of harsher policy decision.
Like housing asylum seekers there instead of allowing them to enter Italy. So what other issues or goals were a main focus at the G7 besides immigration?
The very first top of the agenda for sure was Ukraine. And that's why we have seen Zelensky was here in Puglia. They announced very important defense packages they gave Ukraine.
A deal has been reached among the G7 nations meeting in Italy this morning to use profits from frozen Russian assets to provide funding for Ukraine.
They promised them a loan of $50 billion. They did another 10 years sort of pact between the US and Ukraine. So the goal was to show unity, like the G7 is standing behind Ukraine. And the feeling is also in these days is that countries are really on a working mood to try to lock in as much as possible, considering that maybe next year it might be a very different story in terms of vis-a-vis the election in the US and who might be in power on very important European countries. Gaza was discussed. The G7 has not really pushed anything on keeping Israel accountable for what is going on in Gaza. They have not been very loud other than making a statement now supporting a ceasefire deal laid out by Biden and speaking about a two-state solution, but then nothing more than that.
So, Virginia, these summits happen every year, and we look at them as a snapshot of what's happening in the world. You just gave us a roundup of the hot-button issues of our time right now. This year, Italy invited a record number of leaders from countries that don't usually get invited to the G7 summit. Those are leaders from Kenya, Tunisia, just to name a couple. Pope Francis was also invited. What else about this year signified a changing landscape at the G7?
This is a very interesting point, I think. Somehow it relates to Giorgia Meloni has made it clear that she wanted this to be an open G7 where other countries were involved, countries from the so-called global south, countries from Asia, which is a signal of the fact that the Western leaders do understand that alone they cannot sort out their own problems and world problems. We have to keep in mind that this is a club, 7 countries. When the group was founded, it used to account for 70% of the global GDP. Now that has shrunk to 40%. But what I think is even more relevant is that they account for 10% of the world population. So while back in the days, they counted a lot on international politics, as of today, you have a growing number of countries who are just looking somewhere else, like China, Russia, India, South Africa, that are maybe more aligned, that do understand a different perspective and do not somehow buy into a Western narrative.
So with that in mind, looking back on this summit in this beautiful resort town where the rich and famous vacation when world leaders are not there, how relevant is the G7?
There are a growing number of people who would argue that it's not as important as it should be. And this big outreach signals that the West knows that. So they're trying to include more and more voices to try to say, hey, we might need you too. I do think that economically they still have a value. Like, we're still talking about the US, about Japan, Canada, the European Union's strongest economy. So they do have something to say, of course, in world politics. But politically, ethically, morally, there is a growing unease, there is a growing gap between them and the rest of the world. Not the rest of the world, but like a big share of other countries.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Chloe K. Lee, Tamara Khandaker, and Sonia Bhagat, with Duha Mossad, Ashish Malhotra, Mohammed, Zain, Shafi Khan, and me, Malika Bilal. It was edited by Noor Wazwaz. The Take production team is Amy Walters, Ashish Malhotra, Catherine Nouhan, Chloe K. Lee, David Enders, Duha Mossad, Khaled Soltan, Manahil Naveed, Marcos Bartolomé, Noor Wazwaz, Sarí el-Khalili, Sonia Bhagat, and Tamara Khandaker. I'm your host, Malika Bilal. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow with guest host Natasha Del Toro behind the mic.